Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Professor Kulkarni and Professor Viramani, for inviting me to this international review of business and economics international online conference. I am Dr. Rajeev Sooreea from San Francisco, and I currently serve as Associate Dean and Associate Professor of International Business in the Barowski School of Business at Dominican University of California. I am delighted to be here and participate in this conference on the dynamics of business and economics, a global perspective, which is in fact a very timely topic given the unprecedented times we are all facing due to the coronavirus global pandemic. I am glad to be speaking to you all who are in India and also to those who are in the US and various other parts of the world. I hope I'll be able to bring to this audience some of the latest research findings and developments regarding how COVID-19 is impacting businesses in the US economy. I would also like to offer some thoughts about how India can respond to this crisis, or apply some ideas to the Indian context, not from a health or scientific perspective, which is best done by experts from the scientific community, but rather from an economic and business standpoint. First, I will provide a general overview of the impact of COVID-19 on the US economy and the California economy, and then talk about how COVID-19 is impacting business practices in the future. So let me start with the state of the crisis and the disease. The global distribution of COVID-19 cases has shifted dramatically over the last 3 months. Although it started in China, the proportion of new cases is shifting from countries in Europe to North America, Latin America, and other Asian countries. The US had its first case in January 2020. Today, the US has more than 3.5 million cases and more than 140,000 deaths. California ranks number 2 in terms of cases and deaths, with New York being number 1, with more than 400,000 cases and 32,000 deaths. Different countries are at different stages of the epidemic curve. Some countries, such as South Korea, have been able to engage in strict containment of the disease. The US is still trying to do a balancing act. There is a significant uncertainty around the medium-term and long-term epidemiology trajectory of the virus spread. That is, there's still uncertainty about the peak and the flattening of the epidemic. Recently, we have seen a significant increase in most US states since the end of June to today. The distribution of new cases has shifted from the Northeast states, such as Massachusetts and New York, to the southern and western states, such as Texas and California, although Florida is still a hot area. Californians have been staying home since the start of a statewide stay-at-home order issued on March 19, 2020. There is a roadmap that can allow a modification to this stay-at-home order. For example, ability to do testing, tracing, social distancing, etc. There are 4 stages that we are looking at here in California. Stage 1 is about safety and preparedness. Stage 2 is about lower risk workplaces. Stage 3 is about higher risk workplaces. And stage 4 is the end of the stay-at-home order. California is now, as of July 2020, in early stage number 2, where retail, logistics and manufacturing, workplaces such as offices, museums, childcare, and some essential businesses can open, but with modifications. The state has an issuing guidance to help these workplaces reopen. However, a few days ago, on July 13, the California governor issued an order to close indoor businesses statewide as COVID-19 cases surged. This means restaurants, wineries, movie theaters, family entertainment centers, zoos, museums, and card rooms must suspend their indoor operations, and bars must close altogether. Now, what are some of the macroeconomic impact of COVID-19 in the US? The economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic have been very severe in the US. At least 30 million people have lost their jobs. US unemployment hit a high of 15% in April 2020. Millions of other people have experienced a decline in their incomes. The US Congress has approved a $2.4 trillion package to combat the coronavirus crisis. The government is spending billions to bail out industries, billions to rescue small businesses, and billions to boost unemployment assistance. That historical amount alone is larger than the economies or GDP of most countries in the world. The 2020 federal government spending would be around $4.7 trillion. Just to put things in perspective, Canada's GDP is $1.7 trillion and India's GDP is approximately $2.9 trillion. So this $4.7 trillion package from the government would be the size of India's and Canada's GDP combined. So that's huge. The coronavirus stimulus is expected to more than triple the original budget deficit to $3.5 trillion and push the national debt in the US to 122% of GDP. That is a level not seen since World War II. In terms of monetary policy, the Federal Reserve Bank is printing money to try to save the economy from the crisis. The Fed's goal is to keep markets functioning and keep price stability. This strategy also makes credit easier to obtain since there's a bigger money supply and lower interest rates. Without these and the Fed's other emergency measures, the economy would have crashed already. So Fed Chairman Powell said at a recent news conference that the purchases of treasuries have helped market conditions improve substantially in recent weeks. What about the state of the California economy itself? Right now, unemployment in California is estimated to be approximately 16%. This is higher than the US average of 13%. There are now 21% fewer small businesses open in California than there were in January. Progress was being made since the low point in mid-April with the recent mandatory shutdowns of bars, wineries, breweries, dining restaurants, and theaters in several counties has resulted in a closure of more small businesses. Closures, as you know, lead to layoffs of workers. Layoffs lead to workers claiming more unemployment insurance benefits. Layoffs also lead to lower consumption spending by households, which further cause businesses to close. Hence, the overall result is a downward spiral. Cell phone tracking data has been an accurate predictor of consumer spending, and people are now taking fewer trips to stores, hotels, restaurants, and other retail recreational locations. Reduced spending is expected and likely to follow. What are some factors shaping the local government budgets? The impact of the fiscal packages from COVID-19 on local governments will depend on several factors that are difficult to estimate. This is adding significant uncertainty to the local budgeting process. For example, the public health crisis will drive both public health expenditures and the length of the economic shutdown. Its evolution will depend on the development of treatments and vaccines, testing capacity, and the behavior of the virus in the coming months. In terms of the long-term economic effects of the pandemic, there are several factors at play. Business survival rates, re-employment rates, consumer purchasing power, individual and corporate debt burdens, and many other factors that will shape the economic recovery. Many experts have dismissed the possibility that the economy will completely bounce back in a V-shaped recession. That is a short, sharp shock followed by a return to previous levels of employment and economic growth. But now instead, we're talking about a U-shaped recovery or an L-shaped recovery that is going to take more time to recover. Federal aid to state and local governments could take the form of direct allocations, lending, and certain categorical funding, such as Medicaid or education. Democratic policymakers have proposed $1 trillion in federal aid to state and local governments. The California state budget itself depends on many factors. The governor's budget proposal of May 14 includes significant program cuts, 10% pay decrease for state workers, some new revenue sources, as well as borrowing and drawing on reserves. It will take several months to know the impact of the state budget on local governments. Finally, state and local policy choices made in the coming weeks and months will determine whether the public sector helps California's economic to recover or not. After the Great Recession, which is back there in 2008 and 9, California's public sector lagged the private sector in job recovery, creating a drag on the economy and exacerbating poverty and inequality. Fiscal policy that invests in the public sector rather than cutting services and jobs will be important for the state's long-term recovery, particularly given the importance of the public health infrastructure to permit reopening of businesses, schools, and other facilities. Now, what we have learned from this crisis, what has the crisis shown in particular? The COVID-19 crisis has exposed many things. First, it revealed that the US was not as well equipped to deal with such a health pandemic. The US health sector does not have sufficient resources to confront the virus. Second, small businesses, which are the backbone of the US economy and trade, do not have the liquidity to survive several months of business closure. Finally, a study by the University of California at Berkeley shows that people of color and women are those segments of the population which are experiencing the most negative economic impacts from COVID-19. In several counties in California, the job losses resulting from government shutdowns are concentrated in low-wage jobs, also in the leisure and hospitality sector and the retail sector. In some places in California, the leisure and hospitality industry has experienced a fall in employment of 46% from 2019, and the retail sector's employment is down 16% from 2019. Frontline workers in the healthcare, janitorial, and grocery sectors have experienced higher infection rates than those residents in occupations accommodating work from home. Now I turn to some implications of the crisis for businesses. That is, how COVID-19 will impact business practice. Some researchers at Harvard Business School found that, first of all, supply chain will be redefined. Supply chain managers suddenly have a much more difficult job to do. Businesses have been surprised on how dependent they are on China for everything from raw materials or parts to finished products. Businesses did not realize the complexity of the supply chain. For example, the supplier to their supplier, or further down, being impacted by the crisis. The implication is that many businesses will start thinking about diversifying their risk and trying to develop alternatives in other countries. This will change how the global value chain works altogether. The biggest losers from the coronavirus, at least in the business sector, are the services industries, such as airlines, hotels, and the travel industry. These are losing revenue and will have a hard time replacing the cash flows. Manufacturers can run overtime and make up for lost production and fill pent-up demand, but services is perishable and hard to replace. Another effect is that organizations will need to develop honest conversations with employees, thus creating a trust-based culture. Senior management would need to engage in conversations with employees on many issues, and this requires trust, commitment, and communications which are very clear. There will be a need for strategic initiatives that involve more input from employees. Remote work will become more strategic. According to Professor Chowdhury from Harvard Business School, they will be working from anywhere versus working from home. So workplace will become more virtual, and there will be an emphasis on remote work from anywhere. But the virtual world here will not necessarily be in a synchronous way. There will be a rise of synchronous communication, of course, such as Zoom we have seen in Skype, but also there would be a rise of asynchronous communication, where you are not face-to-face on a screen. For example, using Google Doc or Slack. So as an example, employees can work in Google Doc and explain what they did. And some of the employees can wake up in a different time zone or city, open it up, and see the work done. So people won't need to be live as much as since they are still on the same page. Now, some researchers from Canada, for example, the Ivy Business School, like Professor Klaus Meyer, has looked at the three dimensions of the crisis in terms of timeline. First, what happens during the pandemic, then immediately after the pandemic, and finally in the long term. So he said that in the pandemic, the crisis is actually a catalyst for innovation. But right after the pandemic, businesses need to be agile. In the long run, businesses need to think strategically what they need to do. Another work which is related to that done by Copenhagen Business School shows that in the pandemic, for example, restaurants, airlines, movie theaters experience a significant drop in demand. But right after the pandemic, there is a surge in demand. So we're expecting that to happen. On the other hand, medical services experience a rise in demand during the pandemic because there is more need for medical services and hospitals and healthcare services. But right after the pandemic, there might be a drop in demand, go back to that normality situation. But some industries like construction, banking, and insurance, they have more stable demand. So the key questions that we need to ask are, firstly, how will your customers be different? And secondly, how your firm will be different. In terms of customers, we need to know what are their attitudes to new technologies, their familiarity with online platforms. Do they prefer local produce? What kind of risk they have? So what is their risk aversion? B2B's businesses, that is businesses to businesses too, we need to look at what are the different kinds of business practices which makes most sense. Are they using more technologies? On the firm side, we need to understand what are the different kinds of human capital required. Do we have some technological breakthroughs? What are the different organizational systems and capacity which are required? And what is the brand value gain or probably lost? So I want to extend this notion a little bit to the international business sector. So the question we want to know is, how is coronavirus crisis changing the international business landscape? Coronavirus crisis, as we know, has dramatically changed lifestyles, markets, workplaces, business processes, and value chains. International business is not the same anymore. An article in the New Yorker says that there is no panacea, that is no one big solution for the coronavirus economy. We have to abandon all practices and adjust to a new normal. The crisis has made companies realize to what extent their global supply chain are fragile. According to Forbes, intellectuals discuss the rise of deglobalization and techno-nationalism. World trade and investment flows have dropped, and there is a rise in the tech economy to support the remote workplace. International companies have tried to reboot very fast. For example, multinationals have vigorously adopted practices that the world was toying with in the last few years, but never had an opportunity to really put that to mainstream. For example, now they have been forced to do global virtual teams. And they have been forced into those practices pretty much overnight. Educational institutions like universities and schools in the United States, they have been forced to go online in a very short amount of time. So the pandemic is a chance to experiment with new technologies and also embrace the fourth industrial revolution. There are also concepts like reglobalization or e-internationalization and a redesign of the entry modes. We don't know for certain how globalization or reglobalization will look like, but what we know that reglobalization will bring along its own tools, practices, and norms. We are seeing a reglobalization evolving into dimensions of e-internationalization, that is internationalization using the electronic platform. We'll see digital platform multinationals, we see different local innovation ecosystems coming up, global connectivity surging, and also value chains are being globally orchestrated. Innovation ecosystems of global cities will redefine the competitiveness of multinationals and push them to redesign their entry modes in foreign markets. Multinationals will invest where they sell, for example, in China for China, in the USA for North America. This will lead to greater regionalization of MNC investment flows. Overall, multinationals are going to be more decentralized. There will also be more agility in the strategies of multinationals. MNCs are investing in digitalization and AI, artificial intelligence. The very concept of business travel, for example, is being revisited. Air travel alone used to be more than 30% of MNCs' budgets. COVID-19 allowed MNCs to test the technological solutions that became a new normal for business communications. The post-COVID-19 world will see a rise in global virtual teams with different technological solutions, including AR and VR, augmented reality and virtual reality. So is there anything positive from this crisis? Some companies redeployed talent very quickly. Some companies could pivot production. For example, an outdoor gear manufacturer may have started manufacturing protective face shields for medical workers. Other companies have shifted operations. For example, shipbuilding moved from a free to two-shift model for thousands of employees. There have been launches of new business models. For example, retailers launching curbside delivery in less time. And also, workers have become productive in certain sense. Industrial factories running at 90% capacity with only 40% workforce. So the big question that we want to ask is, what will shape the next new normal? A survey by McKinsey and Company suggests that there is a general perception that the current economic situation is worsening around the world. But there are positive sentiments about the future, and this is on the rise. They identified 5 factors that will shape the next new normal. One is metamorphosis or transformation of demand. Business-to-business purchasers and consumers are accelerating the adoption of digital. In terms of B2C, business to consumers, for example, the new consumer shops online and is more willing to switch across brands and focus on local and domestic buying. In B2B, for example, business to business, doctors also prefer remote sales instead of pharmaceutical representatives. Number 2, there would be an altered workforce. Remote work has been a challenge in some areas. Managers who successfully led in-person teams don't know how to lead virtual teams. It's harder to read nonverbal communication and emotional cues when you're in a virtual environment. So there is a communication gap. The recruitment and onboarding of workers virtually have been a challenge. Demand for labor is shifting. There's a strong need for reskilling yourself, for example, in digital technology, because of scarcity of labor in those areas. Companies facing difficulties in managing remote teams will see some workers in silos. So there's a cultural erosion or a shift in the cultural workplace itself. Frontline workers and employees are also pushing back. For example, some of them are refusing to wear a mask. Other changes we see are changes in the supply chain resiliency. For example, US companies want business partners to be more resilient. They want them to have the ability to bounce back quickly from difficult situations, both financially and in terms of the supply chain. They're engaging in asset divestments, that is, selling off the assets to increase the amount of cash they have at hand. For example, the PNC Financial Services sold its $13 billion stake in BlackRock. Some companies are also decreasing their SKUs, stock keeping units, that is, decreasing the number of items they are selling to reduce cost. We see this in baby care products, tobacco, frozen goods, and household care. We have also seen a rise of the state, that is, statism. There's a decline in the confidence in the free market mechanism. Governments are providing huge stimulus packages. So Professor Kulkarni talked about that earlier. There has been 3 times greater response from G20 governments compared to the 2008 financial crisis stimulus package. In the US, a stimulus package is approximately 12% of GDP versus 4.9% under the 2008 financial crisis. So which means that there's a big role for fiscal policy and there's big governments. But there's also a growing political pressure for new regulations and legislation to favor and protect domestic economic activity. This is leading to the rise of protectionism and nationalism. In the end, it all depends on the evolution of the crisis. Economies are reopening despite different public health realities, but we're still trying to understand the virus, the transmission, the science of it, the testing, the treatment. There are approximately 17 COVID vaccine candidates in clinical trials, and it might take 12 to 18 months before anything can be available. So what the future will look like? CEOs are saying there is no turning back. There is an acceleration in decision making. In a lot of meetings, we don't use PowerPoints anymore. People want to interact and talk and have direct communication. There's more need for time to be spent in direct communication with teams and managers. There has been new technology adoption overnight, for example, Zoom. And also, companies are putting the best people on the hardest problems. If those people can't solve it, probably no one can. So what is working now is speed, information, collaboration, resilience, and agility. All these will drive performance in the future. Uncertainty is the next normal. We need to innovate and do it fast. Firms are faced with intense cost pressures. It's critical to drive efficiency and operate with a lean core. Talent management is very important. It's becoming more important. The talent market is actually flattening. That is, remote work means geography is no longer a constraint. Top talent, this is important, top talent will leave organizations with bad cultures and will dictate the terms of work. For example, flexible hours, pay premiums. So Professor Fuller from Harvard says the workplace will be very different. There will be digital distancing, there will be a rise in the use of AI, there will be touchless technologies. Also, white-collar jobs will be disrupted. If there is a rise of protectionism, this would actually hurt growth. Some of the elements of the new normal includes the localization of talents. So you'll source people from a specific area, or maybe from different areas through different kinds of technologies. Firms and people will invest in reskilling the existing workforce. That is something very crucial. You will see a rise in micro credentials, like in the tech sector. There will be less traditional university degrees and CPAs, certified public accountants, for example, which go through a traditional training. So there will be more professional trainings, more micro credentials. There's a rise of the gig economy. More gig workers will be used. Gig workers are those workers that work in jobs for a certain time period. For example, contractors, and they have short-term commitments, maybe long-term commitments as well, but they are pretty fine, they are not employed permanently. So those gig workers with specialized skills will become very important and will command a premium pay. Now, this is interesting because workers will need flexibility, but also they will have more choices. Employers will need to accommodate that. For example, more flexible sick leave policy. Some workers are asking to skip work without penalty if they feel unsafe. Some workers are saying, I'm not required to travel for work if it is unsafe. So how employers will need to accommodate those? This is going to be very important. Employers need to prepare workers who cannot go back to work. For example, some workers who have respiratory problems or cannot get childcare, they cannot go back to work. Other employers may need to prepare for workers who don't want to go back to work probably because they have anxieties about traveling, for example, in crowded New York subways or in Mumbai trains. Some workers are near retirement and they don't want to go back to work. So I'd like to conclude by referring to a survey by Deloitte and Fortune magazine on Fortune 500 CEOs. American executives are concerned about a digital skills gap, that is an imbalance between demand and supply. We have high-paid white-collar jobs. 80% of the executives, however, don't have the digital skills, at least in America. They don't know how to work with the data, right? So this is very interesting because the high-paid executives, they supervise over processors, but they don't have the technical digital skills. So this is a tremendous opportunity for a country like India. There has been an increase in investments in AI startups. For example, in the past 10 years, in 2009, investment in AI startups was less than $1 billion. And today, it's approximately $18 billion. So there has been a huge increase in private investments in artificial intelligence startups. And finally, gig workers will be paid much more. So gig workers, we're not talking about gig workers which are low-skill workers. We're talking about highly qualified people who can work as freelancers, for example, and they command $100,000 salary. So these are going to be premium workers, not just in the IT sector, but also in various areas like operations, marketing, innovation, R&D, HR, and finance. For example, companies in Ohio cannot attract AI experts because they will be competing with companies like Google and Apple. So it's going to be difficult to retain talent, to get talent, and to pay them competitively. So gig workers will become very premium workers. Again, this is another opportunity for India. So I want to stop here and let you have thinking over this process, how COVID-19 is really changing both the macroeconomic landscape as well as the business landscape. Thank you.